Hi, I'm Sunny Dean.
And I'm Scott Drakeford.
And this is the Publishing Rodeo podcast. In 2022, we both launched debut novels in the same genre with the same publisher in the same year. But despite having very similar starts, our books and subsequently each of our careers went in very different directions.
That pattern repeats itself throughout the industry over and over. Why do some books succeed while others seem to be dead on arrival?
In this podcast, we aim to answer these questions and many more, along with how to build and maintain an author career.
Everyone signing a contract deserves to know what they're really signing up for. In an industry that loves its secrets, we'll be sharing real details from real people. We'll cover the gamut of life as a Big Five published author, from agents to publishing contracts, finances, and more.
I do enjoy your intro music. Is that you guys play? Is that you on bass?
No. I went and found some royalty-free, like copyright-free music.
Right. I'm very disillusioned now because I just imagined at the beginning of every episode you're there sort of playing bass as you introduce the.
Yeah, I can just about tell a bass from a regular guitar. So.
We really should have Lee record something for us, shouldn't we? Seems like a missed opportunity.
Welcome to this week's Publishing Rodeo. We're a little bit out of sync with the order of our episodes, but that's all right. I don't think anyone will mind. With us today is Mark Stay, who founded and ran for 7 years, although I think he's recently stepped down. We'll talk about that in a second. Founded and ran the Bestseller Experiment, which, funnily enough, is a podcast I used to listen to. And then quite randomly last June, I agreed to do this sort of book event in Medway Literature Festival, and didn't really pay attention to anything on the sheet, and sort of turned up. I was like, oh, Mark Stay is the other author that I'm in conversation with.
Who the hell are you? What are you doing at my event? Get out.
Oh, it was brilliant fun, even though he told me a story about his first live theatre performance that has haunted me ever since. So if you want to introduce yourself, Mark, and the many, many things that you do and have done, that would be a fantastic place to start.
Thanks, folks. And thanks for having me on. I really appreciate this. I'm a big fan of the podcast. Listen to every one of them. So, so I'm Mark Stay. I'm an author and screenwriter. I worked in bookselling and publishing for 25 years as well. So I went to Waterstones for a Christmas job and ended up working in the industry for over half my life. Yeah, I was co-presenter of the Bestseller Experiment, which is still going, I hasten to add. I just stepped back for perfectly amicable reasons last Christmas, simply because I've got a lot on this year, a lot of writing projects, and it was taking up, I don't have to tell you guys this, it was taking up a lot of time and energy, which I sort of had to focus on stuff elsewhere. So yeah.
It does take up. Did you ever find that, the pressure of it as well? Because I think Bestseller really took off in some quadrants, I guess. You're kind of the Guardian in all sorts of places.
Yeah, we had a really busy first year, and we only meant to run for a year. The idea was that myself and Mark, because I'd co-written the film Robot Overlords, and I did the film novelization, and that was my first book. And people, when you write a movie, people come out of the woodwork. And an old friend of mine that I knew from my teens, a guy called Mark DeVoe, got in touch. He said, "I've always wanted to write a novel. This is great. You're living the dream." He said, "I've always wanted to write a novel, but I always get stuck at 20,000 words." And one thing led to another, and we sort of challenged ourselves to co-write a novel within 12 months and self-publish it. But the thing that we did, I think the best thing that we did, was we challenged our listeners to beat us to it. So we said, if you've got a half-written novel in a drawer, or if you're just starting from scratch, or you've got one you wrote 5 years ago and put it away, dig it out, listen to the author, because we kicked off a bit of luck. It was Gallant's Fest just before we started recording. So I got Joanne Harris, Joe Hill, Joe Abercrombie, all the Joes. We got some fantastic authors to start us off. And then we had the Bryan Cranston episode as well, which went viral because we rather cheekily said to him, because this was 2016, we said, if Trump gets in, do you want to go and live with Mark DeVoe in Canada? And it got reported as Bryan Cranston will leave America if Trump gets in. And we were on Fox News. We had bots trying to crash our website, all sorts of stuff. But we were everywhere. But the key thing was that first year, all these amazing people were listening to, who still listen to it now, who are part of the BXP group, which is a group on Facebook if you're a Patreon supporter, and some are in the Bestseller Academy now, which Mark started a couple of years ago. And I've got a shelf over there, 2 shelves there, sort of 2 deep, full of people who've been published because they were inspired by someone or something they heard on the show. I mean, one of the first ones was Mike Shackle, who got a 3-book deal with Gollancz for his book. So, we've had award winners, Kindle Storyteller Award winners, RNA Award winners. So it was just an absolute joy. It's one of the best things I've ever done. We discovered this amazing, amazing community of people who all support each other. Yeah, but after 580 episodes and 7 years of it, there's a couple of things happening this year which might happen, I thought it's better to quit while I'm ahead and just focus on these other things. Very happy I did it. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, that resonates with me a huge amount because I have generally a very anxious person. I just have this sense that because podcasts, in a way, they're very much more a cult of personality than books are, or yes, authors tend to be. And there's always that thing where it's like you're bound to say something eventually, or have on the wrong guest, or have on the wrong topic, or handle it in the wrong way. And I'm so conflict avoidant, and the idea just sends me to a spiral. So quit while we're ahead is probably going to be my motto for season 2.
It's interesting what you say about the cult of personality thing, because, what the world really needs is 2 more white blokes telling everyone what to do. But we did reach a turn. If you listen to the first episode we did with Sarah Pimborough, and Sarah's a fantastic guest. It was absolutely brilliant. But Sarah was very sweary, as you'd imagine, and she'd had a couple of drinks as well, and it got and we were like naughty schoolboys egging her on, as if to say, be naughty, Sarah, and she duly obliged. And we that episode didn't really sit comfortably, because I know Mark DeVoe, he was thinking, I want this to be a legacy for my kids. I want my kids to be able to listen to this. So we decided very early on to make it basically PG-13, at the most 1 F-bomb per episode. So yeah, although we did do a whole episode on swearing, we've done a whole episode on sex scenes, so we warned people ahead of that. But it was, you have to find the tone very early on. And we wanted it to be best foot forward, kind of positive. Yeah. We're and I mean, I love your podcast, but we're like the anti-publishing rodeo, and we don't cover things up. We don't pretend it's all wine and roses, but we try and think of the positive way to get over those things and approach those things.
Yeah, no, and that's actually very fair. And one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, which is basically, I always felt in the early days when I was looking into indie, and again, when I was listening to Bestseller Experiment, the idea you would set out with a goal that's very high and very specific and try and achieve it. And I do think, I don't want to make authors feel like I'm blaming them, but I do think there is a culture of defeatism sometimes in trad.
Oh, God, yes.
Where we just kind of like, well, we're not going to make anything, so there's no point. Let's just accept the pennies. And maybe you can't do anything about it, but you can, I don't know, it just, if you decide that it can't change, it doesn't. And that's true in lots of things.
I mean, I think it's a trait that all creatives have, I think. I think because we train ourselves to see the best of things and the worst of things. And every author I know is a very empathetic person, and they're very caring. And it's why there is this massive liberal bias in writing creativity. It's because we care about other people. We think, what that person over there who's different to me, how would they think? I'm going to put myself in their shoes for a short while and try and figure out what that's like. So, we're very empathetic. But also, I think the flip side to that is we are also doom scrollers. We're thinking, and we are training ourselves. I mean, I don't know about you. When I'm writing, I like to be an Old Testament God to my characters. I like to do the absolute worst thing to them and test them and prod them and make their lives an absolute misery, which means I'm always thinking of the worst thing to do. So, you have this anxiety sort of simmering away in the background if you're creative, because you have imagined apocalypses and murders and terrible things. So I think that's always there. And I don't think it's just a trad thing. I think you get a lot of indie authors who think it's going to be easy because maybe they were a mid-list author and thought, great, I'm going to go out and do my own thing. It's really, really hard. Yeah, it's expensive, especially if you're going to pay for an artist, pay for copy editors, proofreaders, all that kind of stuff. It's not cheap. And then your first book doesn't do anything. And it's like, what do I do? I've made a terrible mistake. So there's, there are, what we never wanted to do was say to people, if you listen to those early episodes, Mr. D talks about a formula and the 7 secrets. And I was always, there are no secrets. There's a lot of luck. There's a lot of being in the right place at the right time. There's a lot of perseverance is involved. I think that's probably one of the biggest lessons we've learned is you have just, if you really want this, learn to love the process because there are no promises. You know, even authors who are at the absolute peak of their game. You know, I worked in the industry for 25 years. I remember when Orion moved from Covent Garden to where they are with Hachette over by Blackfriars Bridge. I'm clearing out old folders and catalogues, and I'm opening catalogues. And most of the authors I'm looking at aren't writing anymore. You know, they've moved on, or they've given up, or they had their moment in the sun and it's gone. So, you know, but there are people who are still there, and not all of them are the big best-selling names as well. There are people who just love to do this, and you've got to love to do it. You've got to love the process. And that for me is the biggest lesson that we learned, because otherwise you can go absolute nuts, you know, particularly if you're trying to compare yourself to other people. That's the road to madness, frankly.
Well, for people who don't know your long road, how did you go from, 25 years bookseller to becoming an author? And now you're a hybrid author, so you kind of across all the different bridges.
Well, I like an idiot, I wanted to be an actor. So I did, my wife went to drama school. She got the grant. That's how old we are. And I was working at Waterstones, and I said, well, you go to drama school, I'll work at Waterstones, keep the lights on kind of thing. You teach me everything you know. Then we started our own theatre company, and I had booked a play by an author called Johnny Spate, who died. And I think the family withdrew the rights. So I had a theatre and no play. So in the course of about 8 weeks, I wrote a play about all the terrible camping holidays my family had taken me on. And we put it on. And people really liked it. And I grew up in a working class family, didn't know anyone publishing or anything like that. So the idea of being a writer, I wrote at school. Teachers told me I was a good writer, that I had an imagination, all that kind of stuff. But it just seemed like a dream to me that I could write a film. But when I put this play on, a friend of mine he makes documentaries now, but back then he was what they called a cable basher for a show called TFI Friday, which is when the cameras run around. He runs around with the cables afterwards. He was the one person I knew in showbiz. And he said to me, there are too many actors, but not enough writers. Keep writing, which I think was his way of telling me I was a terrible actor. I can trace that because that was just before my daughter was born. So that's 24 years ago. So I started writing screenplays. I wrote a screenplay that got optioned, never got made. But the producer introduced me to John Wright, who was the co-writer and director of Robot Overlords and Unwelcome, the film that came out last year, 2023. And John and I just started writing together. And this movie, Robot Overlords, a kids' movie about a robot invasion, and these kids go on an adventure. And we somehow got Ben Kingsley and Gillian Anderson on board, and it premiered at the London Film Festival. And while we were in post-production, and I had been trying to write fiction and enjoying it, but kind of floundering, not quite knowing what to write. What was my genre, that kind of thing. By then, I was working at Orion, and we published Joe Abercrombie and Joe Hill and people like that, and I was, in awe of them. And we were in post-production, and the producer said, oh, we could do T-shirts, we could do a book. And I went, I'll do the book. I will do the book. That's me. Let me do the book. So published 10 years ago next year, 2025. And that was my way in. And it was interesting because it was published by Gollancz, and I worked at Orion, and I remember John Wood at Orion saying, we don't publish staff, we don't publish mates. But I said, look, just give me a chance. Let me write 10,000 words and you can tell me if it's any good. And they bought it based on those 10,000 words. And I was edited by Gillian Redfern, who was a goddess, amazing. I learned so much just from finishing and going through that process. I mean, that's the other thing that a lot of people who haven't been published yet, that thing of going through and I knew, I worked in the industry, I knew how it worked, but until you go through that thing of redrafting, an edit, the copy edit was the real surprise. It's amazing. Proofreading, all of that. And so, it came out. Unfortunately, the film did not get a great release. I think it's officially a cult film now. So. But people seem to like it. But people did enjoy the book, and that kind of spurred me on to do more. So I then, we did Back to Reality for the podcast, which was the book that we self-published. And then I did a fantasy novel called The End of Magic, and I'm working on a sequel to that now. And then 3 years ago, the first of the Witches of Woodville series came from Simon & Schuster. I remember when I started working at Waterstones in Dorking, and American listeners would be going, really? There's a place called Dorking? Yes, there is a place called Dorking in Surrey. And it was the smallest Waterstones in the whole chain. And back then, Waterstones insisted that everyone have a degree who worked there. And I haven't been to university. And I snuck in because I was just going to work there for Christmas. But they liked me and they kept me on. And I remember meeting the sales reps and meeting authors and thinking, this is it, I'm in. This thing that I never thought I could get into, I've got a foot in the door. And I thought, that's it, I'm never leaving. And I learned so much. I just soaked up everything. I went in every course I could go on, went to every convention, all that kind of stuff, and just learned everything I could about how the whole system works. So everything you've been talking about, publishing meetings, acquisition meetings, art meetings, editorial meetings, I've been in them all. I've seen them all. And because I've seen both the best and the worst of it, I kind of have quite a sanguine attitude to it all, because I know that in the end, what really counts is loving the process and perseverance, I think. That's a very long answer. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I asked for it. It's just fascinating to me because you come at it from completely the opposite angle, I think, almost like through the industry and then out to authorhood.
Which is cheating, kind of, but
well, that seems to be more and more common these days. I'm curious. What's that?
And I was just going to say, there's no regular path in. Like so many people you talk to, it's like the received wisdoms. You're not supposed to ask people on podcasts for their story of how they got into their role, right? Like I've heard that before. But in publishing, I feel like everyone is such a weird path in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, 580 episodes of the podcast. I don't think we've heard the same story twice. There are a lot of lawyers. That's one pattern I noticed, because lawyers, they are one of the few professions where you get a lawyer on the show that say, "Oh, and I took a year off to write my novel." It's like, "Oh, did you now? Okay." Good for you. Which, a lot of us mere mortals can't do. But that's one thing I've seen cropping up. But yeah, I mean, I remember when I worked at Headline, I remember one of the editors, Charlotte Mendelsohn, she published a novel while I was working there. And I was at Orion. Robin Stevens, a fantastically successful children's author. I remember her getting her book deal there and thinking, wow, fantastic, So it is becoming, I think a lot of people do see it as a great training ground just to learn about the industry, because as you guys have pointed out, this industry has its own language, its own mysteries, its own weird way of doing things. When outsiders come in, they go, "Well, why do you do it like that?" And they kind of that's how we've always done it, And I was lucky enough to work through what I think was the biggest publishing revolution since the Gutenberg Bible, which is the ebook, revolution. And I was because I was the only person who in the sales team who knew what a podcast was. They said, "Oh, you can look after Amazon then," because I was the young person who knew about digital. So yeah, I looked after that, and I got the first ever Kindle device, and used to meet with, Kindle team and the Amazon team and all those folks, and Apple and Kobo, and saw them all sort of rise and, become different things as time went on.
So, and forgive any ignorance on my part about your path and your process and everything. One thing that is really interesting to me, and I'd love to hear your take on, is you had been in the industry at Orion. Sounds like you were on the sales side at
Yes.
Orion and the publishers. Yeah. I think we're going to have more questions on that too. But you had been published traditionally, and then you start your podcast, and you decided to go self-publish for
Yes.
that. Before you even wrote it, you just didn't consider trad as a path for that. I'm curious as to why that would have been and how that worked out.
Because I think if we had, we'd still be waiting for it to be published. We had the conversation. We said, look, we can go down the traditional route, or we know we can self-publish. We know, and I'd never done it up to that point, and I was curious to know more. And we just thought, as well, just as an example to our listeners, we could say, look, we're going to make all these mistakes on the way. We'll make the mistakes so you don't have to, kind of thing. And because we'd set that deadline of a year. So not only did we have to write it and edit it and all the other stuff, we had to publish it exactly 1 year later, which we did. So it was the only conceivable way of releasing a book in a year. And that was what was kind of exciting about it. And also, we kind of thought, there was a part of me thinking, there's a danger this book could end up a complete dog's dinner and a complete disaster, and no publisher would pick it up necessarily. Fortunately, it's a very good book that I'm very proud of. So it all turned out fine in the end. But yeah, it was mainly just because we set that 12-month deadline. It was the only way we could possibly do it. No, I mean, you know what it is. From the minute you sign a contract with a publisher, it could be 18 months before your book is in stores. Yeah. So which I knew, and I told Mark, my co-presenter. So as soon as we kind of thought, we did. I mean, once it had been published, we did approach a couple of publishers and say, are you interested? And they were kind of like, well, you've done it, you've put it out there now. So
back in the early days, I remember I gave myself 2 years to try and write and publish a novel, which I thought was like a huge amount of time because I knew nothing. And now I look back and just find that absolutely hilarious.
That's it. I mean, again, a lot of people, because what you only ever see are the headlines. You see, oh, so-and-so got a 6-figure deal and they sold the film rights and blah, blah, blah. That I had this just last year when the movie came out. I had the BBC Southeast News come to my house and interview me. And, I talked for an hour. But the only thing that ended up in the piece was the fact that Warner Brothers had paid £1.1 million for the script, which is the most that Warner Brothers UK had ever paid for a horror script. But the way they reported it was that the money went to me, and it didn't. It went on the budget. So, they're always looking for that hook, that kind of, money kind of thing. So when, I'm sure you've had this as well, when you visit family or friends and say, I'm an author, and they go, bet you're doing all right for yourself, aren't you? It's like, no, I'm stony broke, so there is that mythology. And unfortunately, and you see there are courses that will promise you millions if you sign up to do their course and blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of mythology out there, which I'm glad you guys are doing your best to,
trying
give us a reality check,
So when you're doing, you must have come into it with a lot of sales experience, a lot of awareness of how bookshops are working, and without wanting you to condense kind of 7 years of podcast, what were some of the big takeaways? Because, if you're advising authors for things they can do, whether they're indie or trad, to give their book a good shot, to try and build themselves up. Because I felt like it was very much a bootstrap operation where you were setting out to do, to basically launch your book as well as you possibly can. And I think for a smaller press or even mid-list authors, there's a lot there that they could learn from.
I think one of the most important things we did was build a community. And I realized that not every author can do this with a podcast, but that was one of our goals. We thought, well, we'll build a community around us when we launch the book. But even so, I think one of the most important things you can do as an author is get your little one-page website. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate, because God knows we all need a little corner of the internet that we can call ours, because social media is at the whims of billionaire man babies, and they can, And my co-presenter, Mark DeVoe, he is a musician, had a band, and his band had 80,000 followers on I forget what it's called now. What was the social media platform before Facebook? But anyway, MySpace. Thank you.
Holy shit!
And everyone just moved to MySpace, and he lost them all overnight. And so, another big lesson we learned was start a newsletter. Just start a newsletter, because each one of those people who signs up to your newsletter is a reader who's going to tell another reader who's going to tell another reader. So it's build your readership straight away, day one, before you've even finished your book, because by the time the book comes out, it's kind of too late. You need to have a small audience there that you can at least talk to and can become your champions. In terms of what to write, I'm very much a do as I say, don't do as I do kind of person, because, I think the big difference we've noticed is that, particularly say if you're writing fantasy, if you're going traditional, what they're looking for are exciting new voices and new takes on the genre. They're looking for people who can push the boundaries, who can bring something new. If you're going self-publishing, what readers want there is straight down the line fantasy. They want dragons, and they want battles, and they want quests, and so that's a huge generalization, but that's one of the things I've noticed from and same with crime as well. If you're writing straight down the line cozy crime, detective crime, whatever, you can do very, very well self-publishing or going with the digital first publisher. But if you want to push boundaries, if you want to do something that's different and you have an exciting voice that's not like everyone else, then trad might be the way to go. Again, huge generalization, but that's kind of one of the big patterns that I've seen, particularly recently, the way the industry is going, because they're taking on fewer and fewer authors.
I'm really glad you said that, actually, because one of the things that does drive me nuts is I think there's an agent that said on Twitter the other day, he was talking about how the market gets oversaturated, and his replies filled up with all these people saying, well, it's because trad only wants generic books and that's what sells. And it's like, but it actually doesn't, because what sells in trad is the books that cross genres. Yes, when you cross out of a genre and you grab all the mainstream readers, and not to pick on anyone particularly, because this is a sentiment I've seen in lots of different places, but one of the things people were saying in that thread is, show us the evidence, show us the statistics for this, because the books that tick the genre boxes and are the least original are the ones that sell. And that's just not true. We do have the evidence and the statistics for it, and consistently the books which break out in a massive way in genre fiction are the ones which cross their genre boundaries and find a readership outside of the usual box. And we see that again and again. That is a repeating pattern. That's how to find big breakout success, at least for sci-fi and fantasy.
But I think as well, where you do cross genres like that, you need a publisher's reach to find those readers. And get you in bookstores, get you at festivals and talks and conventions where you can talk about your book, and maybe get you on local radio and podcasts and what have you. Whereas if you're writing something that's straight, and there's nothing wrong with this, I love straight down the line genre. It's this is all good stuff. It's just, if you're doing Facebook ads and Amazon ads, it's easier to do that, and you might as well do it yourself, and you might as well scoop up 70% of the royalty in order to sell that. So I think, so me, I'm traditionally published by Simon & Schuster, and they've been fantastic. But also I got, like, The End of Magic was a crowdfunding exercise with Unbound, which was 5 years ago. I got the rights back, and because Unbound didn't really know how to sell fantasy, frankly, but it was great to do. I enjoyed the process, and I kind of thought, I'll just do that as a one-off. But when I knew that I could get the rights back, I thought, let's see if I can write a sequel. So I'm writing a sequel, and I'm going to self-publish that this year, and there'll be a third one next year. And it's not straight down the line fantasy, but it's as close to genre as I get. I mean, one of my problems is I can never write anything that's straight. I have to be a bit weird and go off the main road a little bit, because that's just me. But yeah, so I'm self-publishing that. And I think for the future, I will take each project as it goes. I'm currently co-writing a revenge thriller with another author, and she and I have been traditionally published, and we're thinking we are gonna put aside our weird little quirks for this one. We are going to try and write something that is, mass market and commercial, and we will try the publishers first, just to see if we can get that big deal, because this is an international story. It's set all over the world. We've got an American lead, a British lead. Let's see where we can go with that. So yeah, it's kind of a horses for courses attitude at the moment.
I am curious about how that turned out, right? Because you built a whole podcast around getting a book to be a bestseller, and then you managed to become a bestseller, Amazon bestseller or whatever else. Are you okay with sharing what that looked like from a monetary standpoint compared to what you might expect from launching something similar to trad?
Well, I mean, my experience was all in traditional publishing, and there was a way that we do things, as you folks will know about. So you're working with retailers for promotions, you're working with wholesalers, you're doing those conventions and things like that. Whereas indie was completely new to us, and so we were kind of going in a bit kind of newbies, essentially. So all that experience didn't really mean much, frankly, because it was kind of a whole new world. We did get to number one in 10 categories. Some of them fairly minor categories and weird categories, if I'm honest. But the book has ticked along. It's not paying the mortgage, I'll say that, sadly. But it is it's a cracking book. I'm very proud of it. It peaked and then it kind of tailed off. In fact, the one that seems to be doing really well is the audio edition, which I heartily recommend. So yeah, it's probably the least selling of my books, I think, out of all of mine. But it ticks along. So it was, but again, we did something. If you listen to those early episodes, what we should have been writing was a thriller, because everyone we spoke to said, write a commercial thriller. And the thing is, I don't really read. I might read 1 or 2 a year. Mark DeVoe, he's a kind of Linwood Barclay fan. He was a bit more familiar with them. But what we did instead, we said, okay, what are we interested in? We love Douglas Adams. We love time travel. We love comedy. So we ended up with this book, Back to Reality, which is a sort of Freaky Friday body swap time travel comedy, which, as you can tell from the collision of genres there, turns out to be quite difficult to sell. But this is the story of my life. The most common review I get on any of my books is, I wouldn't normally read this, but I really liked it. So, which is the story. This is going to be on my publishing gravestone when I'm finished. So yeah, it was in the end, it's a tricky book to sell because it doesn't fit into any particular genre. We should have written a thriller. If we'd written a thriller and a series of thrillers like Jack Reacher knockoffs or whatever, we'd be very well off. But that wasn't what we wanted to write. And I think one of the other big lessons we've learned from the podcast is, okay, you've got to write what you love, because if you start writing to market, you will be so miserable, so utterly miserable with what you're writing. And I've met authors who've done that. They're kind of, well, everyone's running, fantasy's not selling, so I'm going to write a thriller. And they're just, they sell more, but they're not happy with it. So it's, like I say, horses for courses. To thine own self be true in the end, but you may be skint as a result.
You've sort of written the exact opposite book of what you're telling people to do for indie, and I do find that funny.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Like I say, do as I say, don't do as I do. And the irony is, we've got, like I say, all these authors who, romance authors who've written really good commercial romance and commercial thrillers and commercial fantasy and science fiction. They've all done better than we have. This is the thing. Our listeners are our legacy. These are the people who've done fantastically well because they did listen and take the lessons on board, unlike me.
I think it's worth it for the conversations, honestly. I think, because Scott and I can never be bothered to monetize or anything like that. And I think we didn't want to be beholden to anyone, and just we're never that organized. But the conversations will stay with me for a long time. Yeah.
And we say things that people don't necessarily want to endorse.
Have you had any blowback on this after your first season? Have you had publishers or agents come up to you and say, "Do you want to dial it down a bit? Do you want to?" Because I love it. I love the honesty of it. But it's you do talk about things that authors aren't supposed to talk about.
Not for me, because I'm in a privileged position of basically saying that my experiences are generally good.
Right.
I'll leave Scott to answer his question how he sees fit.
Yeah.
You can plead the fifth, Scott. You don't have to answer
that. I try not to anytime I can. I expected a lot more blowback than there has been. I obviously have my issues with how my debut went, but after the podcast, they've actually been quite excellent. My agent and I requested an editor change, and it was granted. I'm now with an editor that fits a lot better. And yeah, I mean, I'm not encouraging people necessarily to go out and air all the dirty laundry they can, but I do think that it's been received well, even by people who I thought wouldn't receive it well, just because they understand what's going on behind the scenes, right?
Well, that's really good to hear, and I'm glad you've heard that, because I mean, a couple of things. One big lesson I learned from working for a traditional publisher: the squeaky wheel gets the oil. It was the authors who, and these were authors who were perfectly polite. They weren't being dicks. They were saying, "I've got a problem with this. Can we sort this? There's an issue with my book on Amazon. There's this, there's that."
Yeah. And
they would get fixed, and they would be persistent, but they would be polite. Of course, there are occasional arseholes out there, but that's another story. But the other thing as well, I listening to your podcast, and I've listened to, when you listen to certain indie podcasts, they're like, oh, publishing is full of gatekeepers and they're all bastards and they're all, and I'm like, no, I've worked with these people. These are good people. They really want your book to do well. Yeah. But the fact is, they're working for big corporations. They're constantly, I was made redundant 5 years ago, and I volunteered for redundancy because I knew that if I stayed, I'd be doing the work of 3 people. And that's what your editor is doing now. That's what your marketing person, publicity person, they are all really under the cosh. So I'm very, very sympathetic to that their lives are made more difficult because of capitalism, because every 3 years, all the major publishers have to renegotiate terms with Amazon, and every 3 years they come away worse off. So they have to drop people and let them go. So, I'm very aware of the problems that they face. But at the same time, the industry isn't perfect. We could do certain things differently,
I will say they weren't totally happy with Scott, but they kind of have learned to live with it.
That is correct. Yes. It wasn't all good feedback, that's for sure. Yeah, I think we will learn the true story of how upset they were when I go to pitch more books, which will be soon. So we'll see. I'll have my answer then. But yeah, to your point, Mark, I think we say it often, but the issues in the industry really are systemic, right? And good people in the industry are put in a position where they have to choose between titles and which titles are going to get attention, which titles are going to get support. And it's really unfortunate that they have to do that, and that there are titles that are picked up and aren't supported, but that's the nature of the business, right?
Yeah. I remember when I worked at Headline, we had a brainstorming session, and it was one of those, there's no such thing as a stupid idea. Oh, great. Okay. I've got some ideas. And my first one was, I said, all of that money we spend on James Patterson, can't we just sprinkle some of that around some of our mid-list authors and grow some brands? Oh, that's a really naive suggestion, Mark. So, oh, fuck me. Right. Okay. I'm out. Get it. So there are some people who are just, if you've got a big brand author like that, what happens is those big brand authors, they are concerned less with sales, and it becomes a dick measuring contest about getting to number 1. And one of the things we were constantly focused on was making sure that brand author X got to the top 10 or the top 5 or the top 3 or to number 1, because some editor had promised that when they renewed their contract with them. Because, brand author X and Y might be our biggest sellers, but we know they're getting offers from Transworld and from HarperCollins and from Random House all the time. They could be poached at any minute now. So the publisher is desperate to keep them on in order to have the big brand name that gets to number 1, so they can attract other authors. But the trouble is, when you end up just focusing on the brand authors and you're not building brands behind them, which is what's happened, which is when you remove so many editors and get them to the point where they can't concentrate on those growing authors, you end up with behemoths where we're still publishing Wilbur Smith years after he died. We were still publishing, these big brand authors who maybe don't need, to get into, to have that railway advertising or London Underground advertising campaign, because we know those campaigns are ineffective, but they feed that author's ego and they make the agent feel happy. And because the most effective advertising now is digital advertising, because you can measure it. If you do Amazon marketing, or if you do Facebook ads, if you do online marketing, you can say, great, this is the click-through rate, this is the return on our investment. We know this is effective. Whereas when you're doing railway ads, no idea. All it is just, to make brand author X feel better about themselves when they go to a convention, and they can say to brand author Y, well, look at me, I got this promotion, blah, blah, blah. So that's one of the things I'd like to change, but I don't think it ever will change. The other thing I'd like to change, the big mistake I think certainly the big 5 are making is becoming bigger and bigger. They're becoming bigger and bigger in order to square off against Amazon.
Yes.
But Amazon could gobble them all up in one fell swoop. I think if they want to challenge Amazon. They should break up into millions. It's like, do you want to fight one Tyrannosaurus or a million ducks? So it's so
I thought
think
of it that way.
yeah. Whereas Amazon can't control lots of small publishers, but if they've just got the big five, then it's easy breezy for them. They just go in and have 5 meetings every 3 years or whatever, and they know they've got them by the cojones. So those negotiations never come out well, and not just them. They were negotiating with the grocers. So over in the UK, it was Asda and Tesco's and Sainsbury's and people like that, where you're fighting for really small shelf space, but it's a shelf space that can catapult a brand into the top 10. So it was really, really important. Of course, you have chains in the UK like WH Smith's, where if the book is anywhere near the front of store, they paid a lot of money for it to be there. So it's whereas those middle publishers, I mean, the ones that I think are doing really well now are the digital first ones like Bookstore, because they are data based. There's no advances, so everyone comes out of the traps and as an equal, and then some will take off and some won't, and they will go. Okay. And of course, the other thing Bookstore do whenever they sign someone is everyone gets a newsletter, everyone gets a little mini website. They know. And they know exactly who's reading their books, and they know exactly how to target them. So, whereas traditional publishing still flounders. I mean, I know Hachette bought Bookstore in order to learn from that, but they seem to be still making the same kind of sweeping generalizations. Oh, I mean, I would sit in meetings, there'd be some new contemporary fiction. All women in their 30s will love this book. It's like, oh, for God, what? Is that your targeting? Is that your thinking? And it still goes on, sadly. They have tried to address it, but they never stick with it.
So I've got 2 questions for that. The first is you can ask me to say them again if we forget about them. But the first is, how do you see this Amazon versus Big Five war going as we go forward? And the second question is to do with digital publishers, because I have seen in SFF some digital first imprints launch, and they were just bad. And I'm very, very sketchy of them now.
Well, let me address the second one first, because I think that is partly due to the genre. I think that crime and romance work really, really well in digital first, because those authors, again, sweeping generalization, but people who read crime might read 3 crime books a week on their Kindle. People who read romance might read 5 books a week on their Kindle. They devour that fiction. Generally, you don't always see that in science fiction and fantasy. Generally, what you see in science fiction and fantasy is people love the object. They love the book with the gold foil and the spreads and the maps and all that kind of stuff. And they love to have something tangible. Sweeping generalizations again, but that tends to be the case, And there's a crossover with YA. I remember we used to have a stall at Yauk, the YA Literary Convention in London, and you'd see readers with wheelie suitcases coming up and they just see a shiny book. Oh, shiny. And they buy it because it was shiny, or it came with a bookmark, or it came, So those kind of things, that kind of readership, if you're saying to them, here's a new fantasy novel, it's absolutely ace, but you can only get an ebook, an audiobook, or a print on demand, which isn't going to have any extras or added value to it. Then they kind of, well, I got all this cool stuff over here with shiny spreads and things. So I think that might be part of the issue, is the kind of readers who love science fiction and fantasy like an object, whereas people who read crime burn through it. That's my theory anyway, and that's kind of...
You heard it here first. Science fiction and fantasy readers are indistinguishable from raccoons.
You said that, Scott, not me. if I'm at MCM or Galantzfest and someone pounces on me for that, I'm giving them your number.
Well, they know where to find me.
No, I get that actually, because when Book Eaters is coming out, Harper sent me to York, and I was like, why am I going to York? I haven't written a YA book. And they're like, it doesn't matter. And I got to York, and it's like, because it was in a Illumicrate.
It's a beautiful book.
And people would queue, they would get it, they'd want it signed. It's like, but you don't know if you'll like it. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's a collection. It's going on the Instagram shelf.
Exactly that. Yeah. And also authors, if you want to know when your publisher stops loving you, it's when they stop putting specials on the cover of your book. I've been in meetings where that's happened. And, so when your first book will have embossings and gold foil and, the paper quality will be great. And then by the third book, if it's completely flat on glossy, with a glossy cover, that's it. Time to look at another publisher because, they are devaluing you with the extras that they put on the cover of your book. Little top tip for you there. Going back to your question about the big five. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the fact is, books for Amazon, books are no longer their main focus, really. They're making movies and rockets and all that kind of, and they make more money with their web services than anything else. They make so much money from their advertising. I mean, it's become a shop window. The third, one of the things I was constantly doing as Amazon account manager at Orion was removing infringing editions. So you'd have a Joe Abercrombie, we'd have the Gollancz edition in the UK or Michael Connelly, and then you'd have the US edition, which is from a different publisher. And because the US publishers seem to be, as soon as they get the metadata, they spurt it out into the world. So you'd look on Amazon and Michael Connelly's new Bosch thriller will be the only title on Amazon. And ours doesn't go out until, 12 months before publication. So I'd have to fill in a form and say, this is infringing on our edition. And they say, well, where is your edition? So Amazon was a nightmare. Amazon is making money through third-party marketplace sales. So there'll be someone who has a garage, in Ipswich or whatever, selling secondhand books, or maybe they've got hold of first-hand, copies or whatever, and they're undercutting the publisher by a penny. And sometimes that makes them the top search result. And Amazon, doesn't pack the book, doesn't stock the book, but it takes a cut on every sale of the book. It's free money. It's free money for providing a window for big brand authors. So they're making tons of money on that. The books thing, which was the core of their business once, it has become almost a bit of an afterthought. They'll deny this strenuously, of course. And my friends in KDP will deny that strenuously also. But you can't help but think that when they're building rockets shaped like penises, for whatever reason. So it's not the main thrust, bad choice of word, of their business now. I mean, but that said, they do make a lot of money from it, and publishers are utterly reliant on them. They're obsessed with pre-orders, which are less important than you think, and they're obsessed with the Amazon charts, which no one looks at except publishers, and they're obsessed with star ratings and reviews. So it's Amazon has become a huge focus, and Amazon know that. They know that publishers will. The other thing that changed as well is that you could not lie to authors, but you could say to authors, hey, brand author X, your book is doing brilliantly. It's fantastic. And, you'd make sure that if they lived, wherever they lived, their bookshop would have copies, and, they'd have a dump bin at the front or what have you. And they'd be under the illusion that they were actually doing rather well. Whereas now you can't get away with that because they're visible on Amazon. They're like, hang on, I'm getting nothing but 1-star reviews, or people are telling me they hate the cover, or I'm way down the chart. What's going wrong? So suddenly there's a visibility. Amazon has become this barometer where authors go, well, I'm doing really badly. Why is that? So that, I remember the days before that happened. I think this is my theory. This is why, despite the fact he went to jail, I think this is why Jeffrey Archer doesn't do as well, because Jeffrey Archer, I think, not as many people read him as we were led to believe. I think when I was a books buyer at Waterstones, you'd have the rep come in and say, yeah, take 100, and we'd send 70 back, thinking, well, maybe we're just doing badly with these. But I think everyone was. I think once you had that visibility of sales and Nielsen sales and that kind of thing, publishers were able to go, yeah, some of these brand authors aren't as big as we think they are. So anyway, I'm going off on a rant here.
That's so weird. I heard somewhere, it might have even been your podcast, that people think Amazon makes all of the metadata stuff difficult and annoying on purpose, just because it wastes everybody's time. Like, they could make it easier and they don't. But negligence maybe, rather than malice.
Well, I mean, There was a lot of data. There was a lot of information.
Okay.
I mean, the thing I used to do on a Monday morning, I would do my Monday report where I'd essentially compile the sales from the previous week and do a report to editorial and sales and marketing just to say, look, this is what's happening. This is what's, and you would, you got to the point where you could have hourly peaks in sales. So if someone went on this morning on the TV or they went on Woman's Hour on the radio, you could see the spike. You could say, oh, that's great. So you soon got to know Front Row, Woman's Hour, Richard and Judy, they all had these effective sales spikes. I know a lot of your US listeners are going, what are these things? But you have equivalents in the States. So, we did build this obsession with sales spikes and then, maintaining the momentum of those sales. But there was a lot of data to go through. And it did become quite soul destroying because I started as a bookseller, then I was a sales rep for Headline, driving around the country. I sold, Neil Gaiman's American Gods and Stardust, hand sold them to booksellers. That I was really passionate about that kind of stuff. And when I started at Orion, I was going to Ottica's, you remember them, fantastic chain, selling Michelle Paver and, Joe Abercrombie and getting really excited, and Scott Lynch and being really passionate about them. And then I ended up, my whole day was spent staring at bloody spreadsheets, Excel spreadsheets, which I hate. I'd close my eyes at night and it'd be like the Matrix. I'd see nothing but, numbers. So I was it's interesting. In my last year there, before I took redundancy, one of the sales directors there said, you're a nice guy, but you've lost interest, haven't you? I'm like, yeah, I kind of, you've sussed me out because, it becomes soul destroying. It becomes a numbers game. I mean, there was a change in culture at Orion as well. Orion was the part of Hachette that was like the crazy uncle at your wedding, and you never know what they're going to do. And, we would have these massive hits. We would have, we had books we had the Beatles Chronicles. We had Trini and Susanna. Remember them? We had Michael Palin, his travel books. We'd have these massive successes, and then we'd have these utter disasters, which took us to the brink, But we loved that. That was what it was all about. And then what happened when they became bigger, we were essentially taken over by Little Brown. And Little Brown were always the safe bet. That's why they got the Steve Jobs book. You knew with Little Brown, they would do the sums and you get a return on your investment. And in a way, that's what publishing has become now. They're sitting down, they're looking at comparison. Every Tuesday we'd have the acquisitions meeting. It would be, what's the comparison to this book? What is this like that sold before? That's what it sold. Okay, that's what we think we're going to sell. And it was just like, oh, really? We're doing that now? Oh, okay. And it's sensible. It's perfect. It's like doing your taxes every year. It's the sensible thing to do. It's going to save you money. But it did take a lot of the joy and excitement out of publishing, because there's nothing more exciting than taking something that's a bit weird and making it huge and making it absolutely massive and crossing over into the mainstream with it. And it happens less and less these days, sadly.
Where do you see publishing is going? Like, are there trends that concern you? Are there patterns that excite you?
I think what's exciting is you're seeing finally white middle class publishing realizing there's something outside the white middle class that they can publish. So that's something that's finally being addressed. And you're also seeing that not just in the authors, but also the people who commission the books and that kind of thing. It's not going to change overnight. My worry is that it will be seen as a trend, and all it's going to take is a couple of books by non-white people to fail, and there'll be people going, well, we won't do that again, especially with the number crunches. But I do see that changing slowly but surely. I think it's interesting seeing them taking a chance on new voices, which is good. There I am saying they're not taking risks a minute ago, but to be fair, they are doing some stuff like that. I think you might see one of the big five hit some serious trouble in the next few years because they're not too big to fail. I mean, you saw Simon & Schuster try to, they had their merger with, is it Penguin Random House turned down. And the reason they were doing that is because they're doing it to survive. So what's going to happen, with them? So it'd be interesting to see. Like I say, I think the mistake, and this, you see the film studios doing this as well. They're all merging to become bigger and bigger. And I think when Amazon controls the funnel to readers as they do, I think that's probably a mistake because they could so much easier just to shut you off. I was there at Orion when Amazon switched off all our buy buttons for weeks. I don't know if you guys remember that. We had a terms negotiation which came to nothing.
I heard about it on Print Run.
Yeah, and we put our feet down and said, that's it. And then they turned off all our buy buttons. So for a long time, you couldn't buy our books directly from Amazon. Luckily, I also looked after the wholesalers because Amazon bought all their books from the wholesalers. So I did very well out of that. So they were selling them, but just not directly from us. So you might see that happen again. A publisher putting their feet down. But it's I just, the way it's always worked is the small imprints, the small publishers, the small presses take the risks. And then what happens is, the big publishers come in and take those authors and try and do more with them. 'Twas ever thus. So, but I don't know. I do worry that they'll get too big and then one of them will collapse and, there will be problems.
Yeah, it's I sometimes hear people say things to the effect of, "Oh, wouldn't it be great? Trad is dying and it should die." And it's like, but then all that's left will be Amazon, and that will be a fucking dystopia. we'll
really bad idea. Yeah,
living in our prime house.
yeah, exactly. No, you don't want that. I mean, what I am seeing more of on both sides, actually. I mean, I'm doing more of this. As you can see, I've got my own stock here. I sell my books directly from my website, signed copies that you can't get anywhere else. So I do offer something that Amazon does not. So if you want to buy them from Amazon, and I'm not, Amazon are really good. Let's make that absolutely clear. Their customer service is fantastic. And if you're housebound, if you can't get out to a bookshop, you don't have a bookshop near you, fantastic, absolutely fantastic. But it's they can't be the be all and end all. But yeah, so I see a lot of authors offering different things, doing special editions, printing books themselves. I know a lot of authors are starting to do their own audio and sell their audio directly, bypassing Audible. So if you, I see a lot of authors doing that, and they're making a lot more money on audio than they are through going through Audible. So it's constantly changing. It's constantly evolving. I think what will remain, and the thing that's great about indie publishing, is anyone can do it. So, you will still see those remarkable voices coming out of indie publishing and people dipping a toe in and trying stuff out, and then maybe moving on to a traditional and, bouncing back and forth. I think the idea that you sign up to a publisher and you're there for the rest of your career is an old one. And I think the good news for authors is indie means you can reinvent yourself constantly. So if you are in a position where your books aren't doing well and you go back and they don't want your book, fine, I'll self-publish it, or I'll go to a digital first, or I'll go elsewhere. And I think there are more options than ever for authors. And I think there's never been a better time to be an author. Your chances of getting your words out there and read are better than they've ever been in history. The trouble is, everyone's doing it, so it's quite crowded.
Yes. Given that BookScan is inaccurate, like how important are BookScan numbers to publishers when they are talking about sales and acquisitions? Because that's something that spooks us a little bit. The fact that for me, BookScan is like maybe 55% of my sales.
Yeah, and we do that. That does happen. That they'll say, "Okay, what's BookScan?" And then usually the editor or someone in the sales department will say, "Oh, but by the way, it was." It did really well in special sales. It did really well internationally. It did, so that is taken into consideration. It's not the be all and end all. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about that. I mean, they are smart people making these decisions. But it's also their job to save the publisher money. Yeah. So they will probably use it as ammunition against you when it comes to negotiating that deal. So then it's down to your agent to go, hang on. Let's see all the figures. Let's see the whole story. So Nielsen BookScan is probably used as a negotiating point rather than an accurate measuring stick than anything else.
I do have one question. So I'm just curious about your experience on the sales side for the publisher. You mentioned going to whoever you were selling to and selling big names, what kind of attention did the smaller names on your publisher's list get? What did that relationship look like for you as a sales leader?
That's a good question. And when I was a sales rep, and when I worked in key accounts as well, there were authors that we would adopt. The ones, we had reading groups. We had regular sort of reading groups where we'd all read a different book and come to the reading group and say, this is an underdog. This is undercooked. We think we should do more with this. There are authors that benefited from people in-house reading it and being really passionate about it. Now the trouble is there wasn't always budget to actually do that, but we could at least begin that word of mouth thing and say, look, can we print some proofs? Because the other thing that changed when we moved into the big Hachette building is we got a big printing room downstairs, so we could do basic advanced, I say proofs, you say ARCs, advanced reading copies. We could print some of those off in order to distribute them and get that word of mouth going. It wasn't a massive marketing campaign, but sometimes it led to big things. It kicked off an author's career. And when I was a sales rep driving around, I knew which buyers liked which kind of genres. So I would go to Myoticas in East Grinstead because I knew Neil Gaiman grew up in East Grinstead and I knew the buyer there was a fan. So I'd be going to Jeanette and going, it's Neil Gaiman, and she, that sort of would start spreading around the chain. There would be one of the nice things about, and I think Waterstones still do this, is they have key buyers, not at head office anymore, but they have them in the stores. So to go to a particular store and speak to a particular buyer and say, this is the one we want for book of the month or whatever. So there are those opportunities there, but if there's been a big advance involved, then you have to earn it back, and they do get the focus. And there is less and less of that hand selling now, I think, than there ever was. But it's still there. It does still happen, I think.
Right, this is the part of the podcast where we've now started asking people what the smallest hill they are willing to die on. And I mean, this can be anything from a lighthearted hot take to your pettiest pet peeve.
I'd like to talk about American cultural imperialism, if I may, particularly in the form. Now, this is something that is pertaining to indie and trad authors. So you get indie authors in the UK are terrified of publishing a book with UK English spellings in them because they've heard all these terrible stories of someone in the middle of Midwest of America going, well, they spelt colour with a U, 1 star on Amazon. And they all live in terrible fear of this. Now, I guess if you're writing a thriller that's set in the States with American characters, maybe it's a good idea to use American spellings. But if, like me, you're writing weird English stuff or you're writing fantasy that isn't set anywhere, but that's the language I write in, that's the language I'm going to write in. And it is this kind of, I think there's a fear amongst publishers and indie authors that they live in constant fear of, I'm going to get a 1-star review because I used to. Recently, a friend of mine, Queeve McDonnell, who's a fantastic writer, who writes sort of urban fantasy and also does crime thrillers. One of the forwards to one of his books went viral recently because he was saying, look, I'm Irish, I write Irish, I do colour with a U and I use, S's instead of Z's or Z's. So just deal with it. And that went viral. That's gone around everywhere. So, Queeve is pushing the boundaries there. He's getting the word out there. But yeah, I think it's one of those things that drives me nuts. Because when I was growing up, I was bombarded with American culture. I would read Mad magazine and say to my dad, who's Spiro Agnew and why are they making jokes about him all the time? So my dad I had to go and look this stuff up. I had to have this explained to me, all these American jokes about baseball and what have you. So all of that culture's pushed out. But if you try and get British culture into, and I'm not talking about, the other thing as well is you love posh British culture. You love Harry Potter because it's a boarding school, and you love Bridgerton and what have you because it's a fantasy thing of what you think Britain is like. But actually, it's not like that at all. And so it's really difficult to convince. Now, the weird thing is I've self-published the Woodville books in the States, and they do very well because I'm targeting those readers who like my kind of stuff. But when I presented them to US publishers, they were like, well, it's not the kind of British stuff that Americans like. Sorry. It's like, what they do, it just means you're going to have to work harder to do it. And the thing you learn from marketing people is they like an easy job. They like to be able to go, oh, this is straightforward fantasy or straightforward. If it's a bit different, it's like, oh, I'm going to have to work at this. Apologies to all my marketing colleagues who are spitting venom at me now, but it's true. And they know it. So, it's that's the hill that I will die on. And of course, the irony is I'm writing this revenge thriller, and if it gets published and gets picked up by a US publisher, we will have no choice but to go through it and change biscuits to cookies and all of that kind of stuff. So,
I actually really, that's one of the regrets I have for Book Eaters, is that in the edits, a lot of things are Americanized, and I kind of went with it because I was under the misapprehension that I would be doing copy edits twice, and that the UK version would change everything back. And it didn't, and it just went to print like that. And I felt really embarrassed because I did get some reviews of people being like, oh, you can tell this person doesn't really know England. It's like, no, it was taken out of my hands. Yeah. Things like, it's small things like purse and handbag, right? And stuff like that. There were bigger things. I think I'd gotten a note where they're like, oh, maths just sounds weird in American. Could you possibly change it to math? It's like, no, because then I sound illiterate to the people here. I think it's a bit, it's not treating readers very well, right? Like, I think most readers can work out that a flat is an apartment and stuff like that. And it's just... It plays into this idea that publishers are gatekeepers, which I don't like. I don't like to think of them like that, because they are, the good ones are your cheerleaders, actually, and they do things really well. But it's coming the other way. Like, I remember reading, I've forgotten the name of the author, but there was a novel called Robopocalypse, which was kind of a World War Z, but for... got me doing it now, but for robots. And it was a fun novel, but there was a bit set in England where a car drives into a fire hydrant and water goes everywhere. It's like, yeah, our fire hydrant's all underground, and a good English copy editor would have gone, no, sorry, you're gonna have to change that. But stuff like that slips through, so it seems to be a one-way street, and that's what annoys me. My favorite one is I had a note that said that in Newcastle, in the original manuscript, Devon goes into a pub that's called the Greyhound, which is a place in Newcastle, and the note I'd had from Tor was, could you not change this to a more English sounding name? And I was like but it's because they don't know that Greyhound racing is like a thing here. To them, it's the bus company. And I did change it in the end because I thought Americans are gonna think it's like a bus pub or something. Anyway, I can join you on that.
Yeah, you have to make those judgments, but there is I'd like to see that change. And the weird thing is, I think through Netflix, actually, through being able to watch pretty much anything from anywhere in the world.
Peaky Blinders.
Exactly. It will change over time. People will kind of get used to it. But we don't all go to boarding school. We don't all go to public school. We don't all live in big country houses. A lot of us, live quite normal, regular lives. And that's the sort of stuff I like to write about, with dragons and witches and stuff like that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for that. If you'd like to take the chance, could you plug anything that you feel you want to showcase? I was going to say podcast, and remember you've left it now, but
well, it's still going. Mr. D is keeping it going, bless him, and it's still there, the Bestseller Experiment, and all those episodes with me yakking on for hours and hours and hours. But we do speak to some amazing authors. Each one has a different story to tell. It is essentially, a great resource for any author out there. So do check those out. And they've got a Patreon and an academy as well, which is all fantastic. I've got the Witches of Woodville series. I'm working on the 5th book in the series at the moment. It's essentially, you take the last 10 minutes of Bed Knobs and Broomsticks, a witch on the home front in England during the Second World War, fighting Nazis and other supernatural threats. And they're good fun stories. I'm working, The End of Magic is out there now. I'm getting some new artwork for that soon, hopefully. And I'm hoping to publish the sequel, The End of Dragons, this year, May, June this year. And there'll be a 3rd book next year as well. So keep an eye out for that as well. And I've got a movie called Unwelcome, which you can find at the time of recording is on Sky Movies. And so that's a really fun monster movie about a couple who leave London, go to Ireland, and discover they've got red caps living at the bottom of their garden. And we pitch it as a cross between gremlins and straw dogs, to give you some idea. So it's like Little Critters, Home Invasion, all your worst nightmares. So there's that as well.
You've been listening to the Publishing Radio Podcast with Sunny Dean and Scott Drakeford. Tune in next time for more in-depth discussion on everything publishing industry. See you later.